Good evening and good afternoon to those of you who are further west than those of us who are here in London. It's really it's a real honor and a pleasure to be back at Chatham House, to be back with our audiences, with our colleagues, and with our really distinguished guests that we have speaking on this panel today. And it's lovely to be able to see some of you who've done us the honor of coming on with video. So thank you for that. I'm Leslie. I think I know most of you. I direct the US and Americas program at Chatham House, and I'm Dean of our Academy. We tonight are here and this afternoon, for those of you in New York and Washington, to talk about democracy, open societies, and human rights, America's global role since 9/11. As you can imagine, when we conceived of this panel, we didn't quite imagine, and perhaps we should have, but we didn't imagine the summer and certainly the August and the rapid exit from Afghanistan that we saw. It perhaps brings a new light, a new dimension to today's conversation, but it really was conceived of as a way for us to ask the question about America's, what's often referred to as America's moral authority, its role as a promoter of human rights and democracy, the trials and tribulations that it's gone through in the years since 9/11. I personally I had just left New York after living there for 7 years, and I had been in London for about a week when the attacks took place. And like all of us, I remember how extraordinary the outpouring of support was for the United States. But I think as we look back over the past 2 decades, perhaps we remember more the pushback against America's support of torture, extraordinary rendition, and any other number of human rights abuses, a perhaps return to the stage, although certainly not everybody felt that way under President Obama. And then, of course, the very difficult days, which were very different in certain ways, of President Trump. And now I think we ask a question about where America's heading. And one of the important and I think policy relevant questions for all of us on the panel today is what role can and should the United States play as it begins to plan for its convening of a virtual alliance of democracies that will take place, we're told, at the end of the calendar year. So a very complicated set of questions, but I think one that after 15 or more years of democratic backsliding, a context where 75% of the world's population lives in a country that has seen setbacks to democracy, and perhaps in an era where democratic values are deeply contested as opposed to taken for granted. There's plenty to discuss, and we do have a really tremendous set of panelists to lead us in this. First, we have Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who is very well known to our audiences, who is currently president of the Open Society Foundations, need I say any more, but of course, led a long and distinguished career at the United Nations, running UNDP as chief of staff to Kofi Annan and as his deputy secretary general, and also has served in the British government. He will be followed by Suzanne Nossel and Charlie Kupshin. And I should say that Suzanne and Charlie both participated as authors in our centenary project, the Lloyd George Study Group on World Order. So their writings should be very well known to your audience. Suzanne is the CEO of PEN America. She's a leading voice on freedom of expression. She is a fierce contender in any seminar. I've greatly enjoyed working with her. Her recent book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. She's also been COO at Human Rights Watch, Executive Director of Amnesty International USA, and served in the US government. Charlie Kupshin is Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown, served as Senior Director to President Obama, Senior Director for Europe and Special Assistant to the President, and is an author of multiple books, most recently Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself. I hope we are on the record. I hope that you'll see, and you'll quickly find, that we have a diversity of perspectives on the panel, which I think isn't always the case when we raise the question of human rights. So I think that is the goal. It's by design, and I hope that nobody will disappoint on that dimension in particular. So Mark, well, let's start with you. America's global role since 9/11, and where is the US going?
Great. Well, thank you, Leslie, very much. And it's great to join you guys, as always, at Chatham House, and two such great panelists I'm lucky enough to share the platform with. You know, if we just start with Afghanistan, as you say, not contemplated in quite this way when the seminar was set up, you know, certainly it is possible to argue that, you know, in a sense, it is easy to overdraw the conclusions from it. At one level, it was just a very badly mishandled exit, not the Marines who actually did the airlift, and my own OSF staff and grantees were some of those lucky enough to get out during that airlift. But you know, more fundamentally, just the misjudgments of a very stubborn White House, and particularly president, you know, determined to get out almost all costs, and just the failure, for example, to have had a timeline where they could have trained up Afghan maintenance crews to keep the helicopters and planes flying. Instead, they pulled out the 15,000 American contractors and at a stroke undermined the whole air support to Afghan troops. So, you know, the idea this was just some sort of psychological morale meltdown by the Afghan army, you know, conveniently ignores the rushed, unplanned, ungenerous manner of the US exit. But, you know, you can argue, as President Biden does, that it's cleared the decks for a nation reset to focus on the issues that really matter for the US in Asia, such as China. You can also say that, you know, Biden is just about as steeped in his bones and Atlanticist as you can get. It's been at the center of his politics throughout his career, and you know, it's a welcome attempted reset after the Trump years. But you know, I think that is to put that sort of happiest gloss on events that you can really, or circumstances, because you know, just the very unilateralist nature of the way the withdrawal happened. You know, the fact that for all these years, America had prosecuted the war through, you know, enriching contractors to maintain the maintenance of planes rather than a sensible program of training up Afghan capacity in areas like this, showed how this extraordinarily well-intended intervention at the end of 2001 had become by its end a kind of crass occupation in many ways. And you then look more widely at, you know, the sort of conduct of Guantanamo, the use of drones, just the tragedy, even as the US left, of taking out an American-linked family believing they were an ISIL unit in a car. And, you know, the legacy left behind of a situation where today 14 members of the Taliban cabinet, you know, have been on sanctions lists. Some of them have spent long times in jail. I mean, it's a very, you know, America is left with, you know, a very polarized, poisoned legacy in the region. And, you know, you set that in the much wider context of sort of values and the crisis of values in a way, which, you know, Freedom House has been charting for the last 15 years, the decline in democratic standards around the world, in both the US, but also very much in, Leslie, the country you now live in, the country I call my own, the UK. Just a very ugly, polarized politics, which, you know, is trampling over refugee rights and other issues in a way that I don't think any of us had anticipated seeing. So, you know, in that context, Biden's, you know, call for a democracy summit is still welcome. I mean, it's a subject we should all be regrouping and thinking, how can we promote? But I do think America has put itself in a place where it's got to be judged not by what it says anymore, but by what it does. It's sort of moral leadership, which was so important for someone like of my generation. You know, I raced to do graduate school in the US because it was so much the most exciting, vibrant, dynamic democracy in the world. You know, and that sustained my very pro-American position through my years in the UN and multilateralism, because the United States was such a key anchor of that whole system. But today, not for the first time, post-Vietnam, many other moments, Latin America, not infrequently, you know, the American sort of values flag is a bit sort of tattered and hanging limp. And that's one of those, this is one of those moments. And a frankly rather weak president in terms of his congressional support and his political position, I think he's going to have to struggle hard to reverse a legacy of American retreat from international responsibility, which accelerated under Trump, but arguably in some ways began with Obama. Thanks.
We'll come back to you, Mark, on some of your points and perhaps push you a bit harder on what that Alliance of Democracies should do. That would be useful. But before we do, Suzanne, let's come to you on the question of America's global role in the past 2 decades on moral authority, and also what your estimation is of the period ahead.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for convening this, Leslie. I'm honored to be here with my fellow panelists. What was already a very difficult moment to reflect on the future of democracy and human rights promotion became all the more fraught as Afghanistan collapsed back into Taliban rule. The US and its allies scampered away, leaving ideal supporters and dependents behind to what will befall them. And for us, we were not so lucky in terms of getting our colleagues out. That is still a work in progress that is really not progressing. So it remains a devastating situation. I think the Afghanistan experience in some ways was a microcosm of what makes human rights defense so complex. It's difficult to seed norms and values on hostile terrain. The impetus to foster expanded rights and freedoms invariably bumps up against conflicting national interests. Human rights considerations are rarely weighted heavily enough to justify the substantial costs and risks, human and political, associated with unwavering stands and open-ended commitments. So skeptics about the US's role in the world will invoke Afghanistan to bolster their isolationism, criticizing what happened both when the US stayed in and what happened when the US got out. But what should not be lost in the discussion is that for all the US could not accomplish with its modest, ultimately residual force and minimized casualty levels, the American presence was highly consequential for the rights of women and girls, the space for political dissent, the breathing room for rightist artists and intellectuals, the economic, social, and cultural rights of ordinary Afghans, freedom of the press, religion, and myriad other rights. While the gains were halting, the setbacks of just the last months and the hundreds of thousands hoping to flee are testament not just to what wasn't achieved, but to what fleetingly was. I don't think this is the moment to despair over the US's role in human rights promotion. When ideals are this fundamental, there's always something that can and must be done next to uphold them. There's no throwing up your hands or collapsing in defeat. The US should both heed the lessons of its hard-fought experience, but also tune out those who suggest that the whole enterprise is bankrupt. Washington should make good on President Biden's campaign pledge to put democracy and human rights at the center of his foreign policy, as difficult and lacking in credibility as that might seem right now. Doing so makes political sense in that it offers a rare oasis of bipartisan support. It makes moral sense in that it will allow Americans to feel pride in their country and bolster the US's international appeal and esteem, as Mark alluded to. And it makes geopolitical sense in that liberalism distinguishes the US from its foremost global competitors, Russia and China, and binds it together with allies in every region. So I'll just throw out a few concrete, practical areas for how to animate the human rights agenda that I think can capitalize on some of these advantages while avoiding some of the most glaring pitfalls of recent decades. One obvious area I've been thinking a lot about is a focus on exiles. The scores who have streamed out of Afghanistan, plus large groups from Hong Kong, Myanmar, Russia, Belarus, and elsewhere need support to build new lives, continue their activism, and sustain vital lifelines to those left back home. The chaotic exit from Afghanistan laid bare flaws in the global visa system for dissidents and human rights defenders who were left to beg any government that would listen for an exit visa and safe passage. The US should spearhead the creation of a coordinated international system to prioritize and expedite requests, sharing burdens across nations willing to participate. That should be accompanied by a systematic approach to assistance to banished human rights defenders, recognizing the role that exiles have historically played in incubating democratic futures. And I think at a time of retreat in democracy and rights around the world, this may not be the way we want to be working, but I think it's the way we can work and the way we must work. Expatriate artists, writers, and thinkers fuel the moral imaginations of repressed peoples, allowing them to dream, become inspired, and find pathways to overcome. The digital age has the potential to further empower exiles who can now connect with counterparts abroad through encrypted channels and engage in day-to-day affairs from afar, remaining influential at home while forging new lives. The effort should also protect exiles from what I call the long arm of authoritarianism, the disturbing trend of governments, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, Belarus, Iran, and others, reaching beyond borders to intimidate dissidents, sending the message that their critics are not safe anywhere. A second challenge the US should lead on is fortifying the free world from the creeping influence of authoritarianism as it reaches into open societies. As the Biden administration pivots to a focus on China, while Washington can and should expose, stigmatize, and condemn Beijing's tightening stranglehold on its own population, and particularly minority groups, prospects for US influence on Chinese human rights policy are limited. An equally consequential battle with far-reaching implications is being waged beyond the mainland of Hong Kong, as China's mounting global influence challenges norms, institutions, and protections around the world. At PEN America, we've documented the encroachments of the Beijing government on Hollywood, the global publishing industry, the global media, academic institutions, and technology companies. Chinese influence is reshaping the landscape for privacy, surveillance, and free speech online. A complex brew of censoriousness, intrusiveness, and statism is reshaping norms across institutions worldwide, often meeting little or no resistance while trampling liberal ideals. Contending with this challenge raises a host of thorny issues implicating the role and autonomy of private institutions and the private sector, the sometimes porous boundary lines between citizens and state in an authoritarian regime, civil liberties issues, racism, ethnocentrism, and other fundamental challenges to human rights norms. These concerns cut across domestic and foreign policy, demanding a comprehensive strategic response. Finally, I want to spotlight the multilateralization of human rights promotion, and this is an important and positive trend in which the US has played a signature role over the last 20 years. The fortification of the UN Human Rights Council and its position as a premier forum for applying pressure and scrutiny on government repression has been one of the more enlightening developments and upbeat developments of the last dozen years. For the US, there's an opportunity to deepen and systematize multilateral consultation and cooperation with a growing group of receptive governments, some of whom stepped into the breach during the Trump years when US leadership, if it existed at all, was often pulling in the wrong direction. The US should seek to multilateralize funding mechanisms for human rights and democracy support to avoid the problem of rights defenders having to align with a particular government in order to access the resources necessary to do their work. It should coordinate year-round on long-term strategies to put pressure on major offenders and also advance new norms that allow rights-respecting countries to play offense as well as defense. One of the most intriguing facets of the Biden administration's early approach to these issues has been this spirit of humility and introspection that they brought, directing embassies around the world to talk about human rights and democracy, but also be candid about the limitations of the US's system, which have been laid so bare over the last 20 years and the last 12 months. And I think that's been very powerful. I understand why there's been an impulse over the last few weeks to mount a robust, uncompromising defense of the exit from Afghanistan, but I hope that doesn't supplant that spirit of self-reflection and humility, which I think can be an important ingredient of how the US gradually builds back its credibility on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. Fascinating set of very concrete proposals, which are a very interesting combination of maybe old school human rights thinking about staying in the game and keeping the space alive, but also a very pragmatic and immediate agenda. So a lot to think about there. Charlie Kupshin, Charlie, for those of you who haven't read his chapter in the Lloyd George study group, which Anchoring the World, I think was the final title published by Foreign Affairs, wrote an article with Richard Hawes, which said, you know, it's important to get a forum together. You proposed a concert of powers, which includes China, the US, Europe, not the UK, interestingly, but really, you know, cautioned, I guess. I think I've read some of your work as cautioning on putting the values card too up front, primarily because of the need to solve the big global challenges and security challenges by engaging China. But it'd be very interesting to hear from you on this broader question, and also specifically what you think about the Alliance for Democracy.
Thanks, Leslie. Pleasure to be a part of this conversation today. Maybe I'll start just by giving you a broad sense as to where I'm coming from vis-a-vis America and the promotion of ideals abroad. Yeah, I think it's in the American DNA to change the world. It was Thomas Paine who, even before independence, said we have it in our power to make the world anew. And ever since the United States came into being as an independent country after the Revolutionary War, we have sought out to play this role as the Redeemer nation and to spread Republican values and human rights and human dignity, first in the North America, then the Western Hemisphere, and then globally. And in my mind, it has been a major success in the sense that I think the United States has over time pushed the arc of history in the right direction. The world is a more decent place, a more dignified place, a more free and democratic place for the United States, having showed up in 1789 and been around ever since. That having been said, I think that mission has been fraught with contradiction and setback from the very beginning. And in many respects, I think the United States has been an idealist power in its own self-conception, operating in a largely realist world. And as a consequence, has faced enduring dilemmas that are inescapable. In the 19th century, it was slavery, it was shunting aside Native Americans. Then we decided that we were going to free the Western Hemisphere of imperialism. So we kicked the Spanish out of Cuba. And then what happened? Well, we colonized the Philippines, and suddenly we were the repressive power running roughshod over an indigenous insurgency. And so throughout American history, there is this inescapable tension between our noble intentions and the fact that sometimes being a major power in a realist world requires behavior that is anything but idealist and noble. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Let me just make a few quick comments on the topics that are on the agenda today. First, the Alliance of Democracies, Biden's tendency to portray this moment as a historic and defining clash between democracy and autocracy. If this is about democracies getting their act together, I'm all for it. If an Alliance of Democracies is about a meeting that says, what are the best practices? What can we do to make sure our democratic institutions outperform the competition? Great. If this is a new geopolitical dividing line in which the democracies of the world are coming to take on the non-democracies of the world, I'm not on board. I think that's a huge mistake for two different reasons. One is the great problems that we now face stem from interdependence, globalization, that's irretrievable. When it comes to climate change, to pandemics, to nuclear proliferation, North Korea, Iran, cyber, you name it, we need to work primarily with China, but other non-democracies. And so I think we need some kind of format, and this is where Richard and I came forward with the idea of a concert that focuses on cooperation across ideological dividing lines. We know how to work with the UK. The US knows how to work with Germany. What we need to figure out is how democratic states can work more effectively with non-democratic states to face the shared challenges that we all confront. And secondly, we're now heading into a period of international history of a sort we haven't seen for hundreds of years. And that is that China will soon be the world's largest economy. Its reach, geopolitical and economic, will follow in step. This will change the world. This will lead to a situation in which the world's leading power, or one of the world's leading powers, is not a democracy. We need to think about what that means. We need to decide how we're going to operate in a world in which one of the two superpowers is not a democratic state and does not share our values. Yes, I'm for speaking up against what's going on in Hong Kong and against what's going on in Xinjiang and other efforts of the Chinese to repress human rights, but we also need to figure out what it means to live in a world in which a non-democratic China is going to be one of the leading powers that's shaping a new rules-based system. So we're looking at a transition that really comes and brings to an end the long period of history that I think started in 1815 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in which an Anglo-Saxon power, either in Europe or on this side of the Atlantic, has been working with other democratic powers to run the show. Yes, the democracies of the world in aggregate still represent the lion's share of global GDP, but things are changing in ways that are tectonic. A second quick comment. I think, and Leslie, you invited us to talk about the last 20 years. One of my takeaways from the last 20 years is that we overreached ideologically and militarily. I think it started before 9/11, the end of history, the idea that finally the United States was completing its mission to redeem the world, the universalization of the liberal rules-based system. And then after 9/11, we woke up and suddenly we were trying to turn Iraq and Afghanistan into Ohio, and it's been a disaster. We've been spinning our wheels in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya for 20 years. The Russians and the Chinese have been sitting back gleefully, watching us chase unwinnable wars, pursue unwinnable missions. So I think Biden did the right thing. Was the withdrawal a mess? Yes. Did he do the right thing by ending a losing war in search of an unwinnable, in search of an unattainable goal? Yes. Who will be the beneficiaries? Americans and others, as the United States gets its strategic priorities right and sets it on Eurasia and the large geopolitical issues of our time. My final comment, I worry much more about the welfare of democracy, of dignity, of human rights right here in the United States than I do in China. In fact, coming out of the Trump era, what keeps me up at night is not Islamic extremism or Russia or China or infringements on human rights. It's the fact that liberal democracy has been stumbling from the inside out. It's the fragility that has been exposed in our own systems. And I don't think we're out of the woods. I think Biden is right to get out of Afghanistan. I think he looked at Trump and he said, Trump is in some ways a reflection of an America that said too much world, not enough America. What about us? What about building schools in Kansas rather than Kandahar? And one of the reasons I think Biden is retrenching from the Middle East and focusing on investment in infrastructure and human capital here in the United States is to repair the United States from the inside out, to rebuild this country's political center. That strikes me as the top priority for the US for the foreseeable future, because in the end of the day, strength at home is the foundation for strength abroad. Human rights, equality, freedom, liberty in the United States is really what's been anchoring the spread of Republican ideals since 1789. It's not been invading other countries. It's been serving as a model for the rest of the world. Let's hope we can get back to that mission.
I think before I come to the audience, I want to give Mark and Suzanne just a brief moment to respond, because Mark, you spoke very early. Clearly, you have very different views, but there are some overlapping positions. And I guess one is that what the United States does is more important than what it says, what you said, Mark. And it's, Suzanne's proposal to multilateralize human rights gives a sense that maybe putting America right at the front in terms of its language isn't the best way to go. And Charlie certainly indicated that. But Mark, I imagine you have a broader view on this. So I'd like to hear from you. I also want to say one thing, though, which is that during the war on terror in 2007-8, we had a public lecture at SOAS, and where we talked about anti-Americanism on the occasion of a book that Peter Katzenstein had published. And a woman in the audience, Kristen Ainley, who is a lecturer at the London School of Economics, said, in fact, the thing that we really don't like right now is that America is no longer talking the talk. We understand America has always been full of hypocrisies, but we actually like the language of human rights, even when the United States didn't always, walk the walk. We like the fact that the language was there, even if it wasn't shored up by the behavior. So there is a big question about what America says and what it does, and what the balance should be between the two of those. But with that in mind, Mark, your responses, just briefly, perhaps, to your fellow panelists.
Thanks, Leslie. And just a couple of points, really. I mean, I do think the war on terror was a huge unforced error, in the sense that it sort of funneled down the complexity of the issues that we were addressing internationally to this sort of, are you in or out sort of war on terror grouping. And I remember very much as a minister in the UK government, responsible amongst other places for Africa, my frustration whenever I called my colleagues in our intelligence community for a little bit of sort of background on sort of ethnic disputes in the Great Lakes region, or Congo and Rwanda, or South Sudan. There was no spare capacity to answer my question, because it was all consumed by sort of war on terror agendas in other parts of the continent. And, what I think from Afghanistan onwards, it failed to understand was, sort of terrorist groups don't, find ungoverned areas, or areas where states have failed, and move in. So your first line of defense is to make sure states don't fail. And, that I think was where we went awry. We failed to understand the ethnography, the history, the social anthropology of the places we were operating, like earlier generations of diplomats and analysts, and just created this black and white world, which really diminished the impact of our kind of crisis management and diplomacy over the last 20 years. I think on the, and so while I'm completely with Charlie on this issue of, America needing to rebuild itself from the inside, I don't have any difficulty with that, and nor do I have a difficulty with, therefore, where it takes us with Suzanne to, a much more imaginative, more balanced multilateralism, which is American values, if you like, but a lot of other people leading, not just the US. But, I don't think you get there with too much of an American retreat, or too much of the kind of unilateralism that we've seen still such big traces of under Biden, regrettably, on the Afghan withdrawal particularly. This needs a US to regroup, pull in its horns, yes, but not withdraw, and learn the lessons of in its own way, as blind a set of diplomatic tools as at the worst moments of the Cold War, just not understanding opponents, not understanding their motivations, not having the diplomatic creativity to engage effectively with them.
Thank you. And Suzanne, did you want to say a word before we come to Jeremy and a couple of others who have put their names, who put their questions in the chat? I'll ask you to say your question, Trish, and one other. So Suzanne, let's come to you first.
Yeah, sure. Just a couple quick thoughts. I mean, I think one has to think about, when you think about the US's role in terms of human rights leadership, there's sort of two categories, at least two categories that I think of. I mean, I think of sort of what are the big signature things against which we will be measured, the United States will be measured kind of like it or not, and for example, the use of torture became, just a indelible impression setting, image distorting set of revelations and practices. And then the response to the Arab Spring, I would say, I think the retreat from Afghanistan over the last month, like these moments have a very heavy overhang, and how you handle them, goes a very long way in terms of whether the agenda is seen as credible. I think alongside that, there's sort of another category of activity, which is your initiatives and where you choose voluntarily to try to make a mark and what you have to say and to show when the question is asked, what has the US done to advance human rights? And there's a lot more leeway. There's a lot more discretion and agency. And really human rights policy is about trying to get both those categories right. And in the first category, as Charlie always points out, there are so many buffeting considerations and interests that there will inevitably be compromises. I think almost the best you can expect is that on certain of those, the US will pass certain of those tests. It will never pass all of those tests. And I think thinking very hard about what are the most important signal actions and issues where the US will and the Biden administration will be judged is important. And and it reflects there's a difference between the perspective of a human rights advocate, who would demand a maximalist approach on every issue, and of somebody who's served in government who understands there are always going to be trade-offs. It's always going to be less than hoped for, and there has to be a choice about which battles to wage. So I look forward to sort of the rest of the discussion and trying to parse some of this further.
It's interesting that you say trade-offs and not sequencing, because as we know, they're not the same. And some people say sequencing, but you've made it very clear that there are trade-offs, which in some ways is a harder line. Maybe it's a softer line, but I just put that out there. Before I come to Jeremy, Tricia, Simon, and Ian, I'll take them perhaps two at a time. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Suzanne.
I think sequencing is a nice idea, and where possible, it's better to, if there's an important goal that you can't achieve right away, it's nice to think about trying to achieve it over time. But, there are trade-offs in the moment. The decision about whether to extend aid to Egypt last week, that's a trade-off in the moment. That's a binary decision. And, yes, it'll come around again. But, these are the things by which the US is measured, and saying that the preferred outcome is deferred or on the horizon is not always a credible or satisfying answer.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think you had a comment. If you'd like to make your comment, and then we'll come to Tricia. And I know that my colleague Chris Sabatini, who's working on a book on human rights, is bound to be in the queue. So don't let the hour pass without making yourself heard. If we don't have Jeremy, we'll come to Tricia.
So actually just even moving from Jeremy's comment that I see here, which is, not seeing Xi Jinping quaking at high moral statements, but those statements can almost be made through sort of international law. And it seems that, for the US, doing the right thing is not the same as abiding by some international laws. It's refusing to, as most of you know this better than I do, to sign or ratify international treaties endorsed by the vast majority of countries, whether it's the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which then it condemns China's violation of encroachment in the South China Sea, or using military force to extricate Americans who are being prosecuted by the ICC. These kinds of non-compliance, if you like, doesn't this at some point undermine the rules-based order that is seen as being American-made? Thanks.
Great question. And before you answer that, let's come to Simon Clark. Simon, we'd love to hear your question. And if it's taking you a moment to get there, we'll come to Ian and then come back to you in the next round. Ian Bond.
Okay, I was giving Simon a moment, but yeah. So thanks very much. I mean, interesting set of presentations. I think I wanted to take issue with a couple of Charlie's points, or at least get his thoughts on this. I mean, the first was he said something about, and I had probably brutally mischaracterizing what you said, Charlie, but that we were now in the sort of unparalleled situation of having a non-democratic superpower. Well, I mean, I recognize that China economically is a vastly more successful state than the Soviet Union ever was. But we have dealt with a non-democratic superpower before. Are there any lessons that we can draw from the playbook that we used then? Or do you think that China is so different that none of the methods that we used, whether that is in terms of our information operations or our practice of regularly handing over lists of dissidents that we wanted to be treated better or to be allowed to leave the country or whatever, that none of those methods are even worth trying with China? And the other point was about the internal and the external promotion of democracy. I mean, again, perhaps I misunderstood, but you seem to be saying we've got to fix things at home before we can promote human rights abroad. And I wonder whether that's, a bit too simple. I mean, the US was trying to fix the legacy of segregation and so on in the 60s, but was still able to promote democracy on the world stage, including by, sending out American cultural icons, including African-American cultural icons, to show that, American society was not all about people having their skulls cracked on the Pettus Bridge. So, do you think that actually, even now, in a sort of different context, the US can walk and chew gum at the same time?
Really important questions. And I know that not only Charlie, but others will have something to say about both of those sets of questions. So let's come perhaps first to you, Charlie. I'm reminded of the phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, in response to the last comment. But it does seem to be the big question, can you do it abroad when you haven't done it at home? But the question about Russia, the playbook for Russia and promoting human rights in that era, and is there anything that we can learn, I think has got to be something that everybody who's worked on human rights has thought about. So let's come back to the panelists and also Trisha's excellent question. Charlie, would you like to begin?
Sure. To Ian, I think there are some profound differences. One, the Soviet Union topped out at around 55, maybe 60% of US GDP. And it really was never a full service competitor of the United States. I think in the case of China, we're looking at a country that will soon have the world's largest aggregate GDP. And on key indicators of future potential, AI, quantum, automation, scientific research, we're looking at a country with the capacity to potentially surpass and maybe far surpass the United States. And I would remind everyone of the obvious. The United States is a country of 330 million people. China has about 1.4 billion. Does it have problems? Sure. Is there a demographic issue? Yeah. Is there a shortfall in democracy? Sure. But you look at public opinion polls in China, large percentages of Chinese think their country's headed in the right direction, 70 to 80%. Here in the United States, that number is 20 to 30%. And so I think the United States in China faces a peer competitor in a way that the Soviet Union was never. And then the other key difference is I don't really think that decoupling a la the Cold War is going to happen. It's not advisable and it's not feasible. The world is too tethered together economically. And then there are the common global threats like climate change. So it seems to me that we have to figure out a way to live with and work with China in a way that we didn't need to have to live with and work with the Soviet Union. We really separated ourselves from the communist bloc. On your second question, Ian, yeah, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we have to. And yes, we can fix problems at home and stand by human rights and promote democracy abroad, but the two are linked. You mentioned, the civil rights movement. Well, the fact that until the civil rights movement, the United States really had a big PR problem in terms of the treatment of African Americans was a problem in our foreign policy abroad. It did hamper us. Our torture, as Suzanne and others have already mentioned, that's really harmed us in terms of our ability to promote certain values abroad. So I do think that that we do need to establish as our first priority internal renewal and internal reconstruction. Because as I said, and maybe this is the reflection of someone who's been living in Washington, D.C. for the last 4 years, we just passed through a near-death moment for American democracy. If American democracy goes belly up, it will change the world forever and not for the better. And that's why I see reviving this country's democratic credentials and momentum as the top priority for the foreseeable future.
Mark and Suzanne. Mark?
Well, look, I mean, just I'd just say a word on the second point, the international law point of Tricia's. I mean, it's absolutely right, but it ain't new, as you acknowledged in the question. This issue of the US not signing up to things like the ICC, it has been a handicap for US foreign policy for a long time. But I think it does get worse now because, particularly the desire to protect American soldiers from international justice, which was always an indication of American exceptionalism, becomes rather more than that as we're forced to reflect on how issues like torture, moving prisoners through rendition to places like Guantanamo, weren't just things that human rights organizations like mine or Suzanne's would carry on about. But this week we've had General Petraeus acknowledge that probably torture and Guantanamo were the biggest single error of the US engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. In other words, this isn't just a liberal cause, it's a security and military effectiveness cause. And the exceptionalism of not being willing to engage with international justice just enhances that sort of disadvantage that America puts itself at.
Thank you, Mark. And your last comment about it, there being a consensus across the aisle, if for different reasons, that Suzanne, you mentioned early in your comments, I think I listened correctly when you said that there's a bipartisan consensus within the United States for promoting the values agenda. Is that correct? But it just really stood out to me. But also, if we could hear from you on your reflections on the questions at hand.
Yeah, look, I mean, just on Mark's most recent point and Tricia's question, of course you're right, but the problem is it hasn't been seen this way in Washington for so long that even the staunchest human rights advocates have a powerful conviction that this is not where we can go next, that treaty ratification is something that cannot even be broached. And that's been, I mean, it's very, very sad, but that's been the case for decades. And the question is how to bring about a paradigm shift. And, I think part of the answer may be, what Charlie is talking about, which is the rise of China as a global competitor and dominant force that rejects the international legal paradigm and framework, and the question of whether in that confrontation and threat, it is possible to renew a sense of appreciation for the profound stake that the United States has in the world order that it in many ways architected over the last 75 years. There's also a threshold issue, and Charlie has touched on it, which is, and it goes back to Leslie, what you just picked up on and what I said, which is frankly, the state of our debate in Washington. I had sort of a striking experience earlier this year it was not long after the Capitol insurrection. And this terrifying moment where American democracy stood in the balance. And I was asked to testify about US policy toward Saudi Arabia before a congressional committee. And what was so startling about it was that the conversation was completely normal. And in fact, the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee were asking very similar questions, raising similar points, thinking about US interests, through a very similar lens. And it was kind of this window into, a different reality that does exist where there are commonalities of view. And there is a kind of balancing, struggle to balance idealism and pragmatism and credibility, what the US should do in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder revelations, the US-Saudi relationship. So that does exist if we can get to it. Unfortunately, it's been kind of clouded over by this entrenched partisanship and polarization that makes it so difficult to talk about anything. And that is a huge impediment to the repairs to our own democracy, which I agree with Charlie. I think that is an existential issue in terms of the future of democracy and human rights globally, is the fate of it here in the United States. So this is a thorny brew, but I do think we have to look at this moment of this pivot in the Biden administration and try to see if we can rekindle these embers of a consensus that I think do exist and maybe stoked if we go about it properly.
I like the optimism, and I think it's where we need to be given it's September. We only have about 6 minutes left. One of my new start of school year resolutions is to stick to time. So we won't get to everybody, but we will return to the conversation. This is important because Suzanne and Mark are in the middle of their day, not the end of their day. So we won't keep you past the 7 o'clock. So Elena, James, Simon, why don't we come to the three of you? Brevity, please. I know you're all incisive thinkers, so that won't be difficult. And then we'll come back to the panelists. Elena, you're first. Please tell us who you are, even though I know.
Yes, good evening. I'm Elena Lazaro. I'm an associate fellow at the US and Americans program. I'm at the late moment of my evening because I'm in Greece, so I'm 2 hours later than London. My question was, well, it's not a short one, actually. It's I guess this whole conversation has opened again this perennial discussion about, does military intervention help in any way the promotion of human rights? And I think Biden's answer has been in that statement he made after Afghanistan that we will continue human rights first policy, but it will be diplomacy and economic tools. My question is, and I say this because I think this conversation is not just important about Afghanistan, but we've had 3 coups in Africa this year. There's a deterioration of democracy and human rights in Latin America. So thinking more broadly, does the United States, does the Biden administration have these tools? Are there plans for these tools? Some ideas on what they could be, both in terms of diplomacy and economic tools, but also, do these tools also mean engaging with non-democratic countries? Because if a tool is trade, or if a tool is, some conditionality, you have to engage with those non-democracies in order to manage to exert some pressure for them to implement human rights sort of conventions. So what's the answer to that? Thank you.
Great. James Nixie.
Thank you, Leslie. To Charles, really, if I may. I can understand, Charles, that we may need to get over our squeamishness with dealing with non-democracies in pursuit of these global challenges, common interests. It's a valid debate, and you may not want to do that. I can at least see that it's fair. My question is whether it would work, because it seems to me that countries such as Russia genuinely mean us harm. They do us harm, and there's plenty of evidence in the ledger for where they have done that. I won't go through it, obviously. So in order to work with countries such as Russia, it seems to me that we would have to give them something in return. I don't know if you agree with that proposition, and if you do, what, Charles, are you willing to give them in return so that we can have that relationship to deal with those global common challenges? Thank you very much indeed. Sorry for my voice, I'm a bit ill.
Thank you, James. And Simon Clark.
Leslie, thanks, and apologies for the problems earlier. President Biden's betting on kleptocracy as one of his big tools, to Elena's point earlier, to deal with autocratic regimes. Is that moralism or is that a shrewd plan?
Three great questions. Let's go Charlie, Suzanne, Mark. And Mark, when you're answering the question about, what should the US do in all of its tools, maybe you can tell us what you're going to do, since you sit in a great position to change the world, not least on the question of open societies. Charlie, you're first.
I mean, to Elena's question, I mean, I hope, but I may well be proved wrong, that our interventionist inclinations are under lock and key for now, because they haven't really gone very well. Yet, we knew that Afghanistan and Iraq were not going well, but we nonetheless went into Libya, and then Libya was a disaster, but we started going into Syria, although fortunately didn't go in and topple Assad. So at least for now, I get the sense that there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States that we probably shouldn't do this again. And Biden, when he spoke about getting out of Afghanistan, said the era of American regime change by force is over. Does that mean that the US has developed the set of toolkits that you're talking about, sticks and carrots, to push regimes, mainly non-democratic regimes, in the right direction? I don't know. I mean, I think there's a reallocation of funding underway to try to take steps that are more preventive in nature. But in general, to be honest, and this comes to a point that Mark has made several times, the country is in a retrenchment phase right now. We are not looking to take on new commitments abroad. We are looking to shed commitments abroad. And I think that is shared on both sides of the aisle. And I think that the world will feel that, particularly the world outside Europe and Northeast Asia. I think there's just going to be less American engagement, particularly expensive engagement. I think there'll be plenty of diplomacy, but not the kind of heavy-handed intervention that we've gotten used to since 9/11. And then on James's question, a couple of points. One is, I think that we overestimate the importance of regime type on behavior, and that across history, the United States has worked reasonably well with lots of non-democracies, including today, in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And so non-democracies can make good partners under the right circumstances. Vis-a-vis Russia, yeah, you're right. The Russians are tough customers. The Russians have done things in the last decade or more that are indeed quite provocative, both in terms of Georgia, Ukraine, in terms of hacking into the United States, in terms of the way they treat their own people. So no, I'm not prepared to say, let's turn a blind eye to what the Russians have been doing. What I'm trying to say is, let's see if we can't find a way of disagreeing about certain issues while continuing to work together on the big global issues that confront us, whether that be strategic stability and global arms control, climate change, extremism. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. It may require us to work with regimes that we do not consider to be as nice and as democratic as we would like, but that's the world that we live in.
Suzanne.
In terms of tools, there are some new things on the horizon. I would point out individualized human rights sanctions, which has become, an increasingly useful piece of the arsenal. And it's also being multilateralized with different governments adopting comparable systems. I would caution that I do think one important stabilizing force globally over the last decades has been deterrence and the logic of deterrence. And I think we have to think about what this sort of moment of retreat and retrenchment, and, you know, as Charlie says, if the interventionist impulse are being put under lock and key, and that's known and understood around the world, which, you know, I don't disagree with, what the consequences will be, what advantage will be seized, you know, who will reach out. And, you know, we've watched this happen. We watched it happen in Crimea during the Obama administration. And so I think there's also some risk of learning the wrong lessons. Ultimately, these things come down to a balance in which there are, you know, to my mind, sort of few absolutes. Lastly, I guess on the question of kleptocracy, you know, I hope it's a shrewd move, and that populations around the world recognize their interest in not having their wealth and their birthright stolen by their leaders. I think that's part of the calculus that's being made here, is that, you know, no matter what your principles or your values are, that's something at the level of citizenship that people resent and will reject, and requires less of a sort of values overlay to rally around. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I know we're about to close.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Mark.
Well, look, two things really. Just a very small word in favor of very small interventions. I know that the pendulum has swung thoroughly against them, and it would be a brave politician who put one up. But the fact is, you know, there was a period when lots of interventions which came under UN or other multilateral mandates, which had clear goals, time-bound goals to achieve, and clear exit strategies, and above all, a welcome from the principal parties to a conflict, worked. And I'm thinking of things like East Timor, Sierra Leone, even in some ways the Balkans. And so, you know, I know the baby's out with the bathwater for now, but I think we're not going to see a complete abandonment of that kind of surgical, multilateral-based intervention to repair a breakdown of states at times. But the bigger point is about where with human rights. And, you know, and I think of it as you kindly encouraged me to do with my OSF hat on, Leslie. I mean, you know, I think all of us in the human rights world, this is not the first time that we have to readjust from the sort of overly focused on the political and civil rights agenda to the economics and inequality agenda. That, you know, for so many families around the world, economic security and access to basic services is at least as important as political and civil rights. It's not in any way downgrade the latter, but it's to upgrade the former. And that's where I think this kleptocracy thing comes in, because the polling all around the world, which always shows when people feel there is rank runaway inequality, tends to reflect itself in the view that the elites are corrupt and are stealing the country's wealth. And therefore, I see this focus on economic issues as both a strategy for an organization like OSF to squeeze China in the way that the naming and shaming around Uyghurs and Hong Kong sadly doesn't do at the moment, but to squeeze China economically around some of its expansionary activity. But secondly, I think it's the sort of, if you like, in the values argument, the way back for the West. It's about economic security. It's about a decent opportunity for families of health, education, employment, housing, etc. And I think that's where the great battles around values are going to be fought going forward, as much as around the incredibly important political rights of freedom of expression, etc. Thanks.
That was tremendous. And in many ways, clearly there are some profound and also very specific disagreements, but the last few remarks lead me to believe that there's a lot of synergy and a lot of overlap. I suspect that, I won't speak for him, but I suspect Charlie might agree with your last few proposals. But this was fascinating. I won't sum up. I just would say I am tremendously grateful. You all have very big jobs. You have a lot to do. And God knows you have some really, really big problems to solve, and you sit in positions where where we hope you're going to have a big impact, all three of you. So thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I didn't achieve my goal, but I never thought I would, of sticking to the 7 o'clock finish. We will carry on the conversation next time. I'm sure Chris will have a lot to say, and Rutula, I know you will as well, but we always listen to you in the evening before we go to sleep at night. So thanks to everybody, and we'll return again soon. And thanks especially to the panelists.